All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get the show rolling tonight. So, good evening. My name is Tess Gunty, and on behalf of the St. Joe County Public Library, I want to welcome you all to your Community Learning Center. I'm so glad that all of you are here today to celebrate the accomplishment of literature that is the Rabbit Hutch, and to welcome one of South Bend's own back for this special and celebratory event.
Yes.
As many of you will know, just 2 short weeks ago, Tess Gunty was awarded the National Book Award for Fiction for her debut novel. I would like to take just a moment to underscore the monumentality of such an accomplishment. The Rabbit Hutch was one of several hundred books in consideration for this honor. It moved from a pool of general consideration to a long list of 10 titles, just 10 titles, and then became one of just 5 finalists selected. And then she won, of course. During the ceremony, Gunty shared the stage with literary giants such as Neil Gaiman, Art Spiegelman, and Tracy D. Hall.
Right.
Previous winners of this award include Alice Walker's The Color Purple, William Stryan's Sophie's Choice, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and William Faulkner's A Fable. Quite the company to be in, if I say so. The award itself, according to the New York Times, is counted as one of the world's most prestigious literary prizes, along with the Man Booker Prize and the Nobel Prize for Literature. All to say that this is, in fact, a very big deal. The St. Joe County Public Library is incredibly proud to host Tess tonight, not only because of the aforementioned very big deal, but because we also have the privilege of welcoming back a longtime patron to the library where she spent a significant portion of her childhood. The St. Joe County Public Library's vision for our community is one where everyone can achieve great things and live life to the fullest.
Yeah.
And we are honored to be a small part of Tess's and everyone in attendance tonight's literary journey.
Yes.
Our event tonight will include a reading and conversation with Tess with a special guest commentator, Ben Gunty, who last name might sound familiar, it is her brother.
All right.
Yes. Ben joins us from Chicago, and we are so excited to have him here with us. Now, before I welcome Joyelle McSweeney to introduce Tess, I want to offer thanks to everyone who made tonight's event possible. Thank you to the University of Notre Dame Creative Writing Department for your partnership, specifically Roy Scranton, Paul Cunningham, and Joyelle McSweeney. Thank you to Emily Reardon at Penguin Random House for coordinating the details on Tess's behalf.
Good work.
Yes. And to Kathy Burnett at Brain Layer Books for joining us tonight to make the Rabbit Hutch available for purchase. Let's give a round of applause for our And she does a very, very limited supply. Tess is, as I said before, a big deal, and her book is going. So, and I lost my place, give me 1 second. All right. Thank you to our communications, education and programming, and development staff here at SJCPL for getting the word out and making tonight possible. And finally, a very, very special thank you to all of our wonderful patrons who provide us with the support to make events like today possible.
Yeah.
Please give yourself a round of applause. Now, please welcome Joyelle McSweeney, Professor of English at the University of Notre Dame, up to the stage.
I can't even get you all in. There's so many times. Yes. Awesome. All right. Well, hello, everybody. This is such an exciting night. I'm so excited. Okay, so I'm Joyelle McSweeney, and I'm a poet. And I'm the author of 10 books of poetry, prose, plays, and essays, and I teach creative writing up the street at Notre Dame. Unlike our esteemed guest here tonight, I do not have the honor of being from South Bend originally, but I've lived here nearly 16 years. I had 3 babies here. I lost one. I fostered a child. I adopted him. I live under the flight path of the medevac as it comes and goes from Memorial Hospital. That's what Greeks might call a deus ex machina. It swoops in like a god at the very worst and the very best possible moments, and it shuttles people into and out of the plot. I believe every part of South Bend is lit up like that, with premonition and aftermath, faithfulness and glamour, departures and arrivals, marvels which come into view only when you don't look directly at them, or at least aren't looking for them, an occasional uneasiness with human neighbors, and a necessary ease with ghosts. Here, history insists. The river insists. The river lies in her bed through the night while you lie in yours, but on slate cold mornings like this one, she refuses to give back any light. I love the pale bridges that cross the river with their worn plaques from the Works Progress Administration. I love feeling the worn, outstretched hand of superannuated progress hand me across the river. And I love how the geese carry the colors of the river and the bridge into the sky, which is also sometimes the same color as the river. I love not knowing, as I squint across to the opposite side, if I am glimpsing some polyethylene shopping bag which will cling to that branch for the next 1,000 years before biodegrading, or if I am gazing, in fact, at a great blue heron, Ardea herodias, who's the same color and who has balanced just that way amid the flotsam for the last 1.5 million years. I marvel that toxins and omens, even in South Bend, or especially here, may be mistaken for each other. They cross the blood-brain barrier wearing such elaborate gowns of form, bearing tidings of past and future, and such elaborately Greek scientific names. Tess Gunty, who we welcome here tonight, is a true daughter of South Bend, as everyone here knows. She went to high school here, then Notre Dame, then went on to get her MFA at NYU, and as Trey has just related, she released that debut novel, The Rabbit Hutch, in July. It was longlisted, then it was shortlisted, and then just 2 weeks ago, at a big gala in New York that everyone wants an invitation to, she won. In a world of such random events, what a pleasure it truly is to celebrate a victory that feels so clearly right and clearly fated. That's fated. When I knew Tess, it could hardly be fated in 2 weeks. When I knew Tess at Notre Dame, she was obviously a writer of exquisite vision and commitment. One who knew already what sentences could do, and more importantly, what they might be for. It is such a pleasure to see Tess's early vision honed and returned to us, larger than life and lighter than air, like a light ship or an airship, marvelous in its making and in its flight, and marvelous too in what its flight allows us to see. And what the Rabbit Hutch allows us to see, not to put too fine a point on it, is South Bend. The whole unlikely miracle of so many different kinds of people living our separate and collective lifetimes together, the working and the wealthy, the foster kids and the legacies, those who are working so hard to hold everything together, and those who are very clearly coming increasingly apart. Residents of our city will recognize a lot in this book. From the long gone wooden Indian motel, my own views, and my favorite part of the book, to the also redolent dog food factory beside a certain Catholic high school, to the big mansions that are aging like divas up the road along the river, and the long gone automobile company maven who spells out his own name in trees, and a certain ambitious young mayor delivering the long view on contemporary ecological catastrophe in sound bites on the evening news. The Rabbit Hutch fulfills a maxim I've repeated for a long time, that South Bend is as good a place as any to set out to describe the universe. The Rabbit Hutch shows South Bend to be a microcosm of the universe, at least from the human point of view, made up of crackpot plans and everyday disappointments, of signaling drastically to the gods or God for some kind of intervention before coming to realize that we are the ones with the power to intervene. And that it's neighborliness, after all, that's next to godliness. It is with such great pleasure, then, that I welcome Tess Gunty, not just back to South Bend, but specifically to the public library. I am a huge partisan and fangirl of the St. Joseph County Public Library system. Bracket, if you can't get a copy of Rabbit Hutch tonight, you can download the audiobook from the Libby app, use your library card, and you will get to hear a very familiar voice read very fascinating passages from it. I won't tell you who it is. It isn't me. Anyway, back to the library. The St. Joseph County Public Library system, its staff are my heroes. I love all those funky branches with their own layouts, vibes, and hours. The realness. And I love our magnificent new main library. As I was just saying, like, I hate improvements, but I'll take this one. It's fantastic. The public library is the nerve center and the heart center of South Bend. Here we get to amplify our dreams by dreaming them together. We vote, apply for services, pick up tax forms, take our kids to performances and story hours, read the news from paradise, by which I mean books of all types, learn stuff, enjoy the AC, get out of the rain. All during COVID, I would drive by and watch progress of the expansion, and I would physically long for the days when the doors would open and we could all be together inside again. And when I served most recently a stint as the director of creative writing at Notre Dame, it just felt so imperative to me to partner as closely as possible with the library and to work alongside all these other community groups who do such extraordinary programming here. I dreamed of events. This is not an exaggeration. I literally dreamed and longed like a Disney heroine for events such as these, which would transpire in the ballrooms, in the big auditorium, events that would feel momentous yet inviting, like a big party. And here we are. We did it. All right. So I thank the library staff for hosting the party, and Trey Goodhue for all the programming work that they did to bring us together, the building staff for keeping the lights on and for keeping the building open late, Kathy Burnett, if you haven't met her, who is the visionary behind Brain Layer and a true role model for the intersection of community and arts activism, just amazing. And of course, I thank Tess and the Fates themselves, so that we can all be here together to celebrate her big win and to celebrate all of us and to celebrate all of us being together and South Bend. Here's to many more evenings like this one.
It is an indescribable honor to be back here with all of you, the people who made this book and made me. I spent so many hours at this library, as we've said. I remember so vividly the vintage suitcases that were stacked in the children's section. I don't know if they're still there. And they just gave this sense of a journey that you could go on. And I think as a child, that was the most liberating sensation I encountered. I would come here to study. I encountered so many formative literary influences, really. I think the ones that you read in childhood are sometimes the most important books you'll ever read. I am so honored to be here. Thank you, everyone who's made this event happen. And I thought I'd start with a reading, just from it's kind of from toward the end of the book. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's from the perspective of a character named Joan. She is in her 40s. She moderates comments on an obituary website for a living. And she is having a bad day. And so she is trying to make herself feel better. Her limbs function, and she finds this miraculous when she dwells on it. In fact, she finds plenty of things miraculous. Forcefully, she summons her best memories. That time on the red-eye bus when the driver used the intercom to contemplate in campfire baritone the wonder of his grandchildren, the way they validated his life as time well spent. As he lulled the passengers with stories, someone began to pass around a Tupperware of sliced watermelon, and a drunk man offered to share the miniature bottles of whiskey from his bag, and Joan felt such overwhelming affection for her species she feared she would sacrifice herself to save it. A bad summer storm, green sky, tornado warning, violent winds. Joan was downtown, leaving her work early, briskly walking toward the parking garage where her station wagon waited. On the opposite end of the sidewalk, a large woman in her 60s collapsed. Immediately, two people rushed to her side, gingerly tending to her, touching her shoulders and face, speaking to her as though she were their mother, a cherished mother, and Joan understood that human tenderness was not to be mocked. It was the last real thing. Dining alone on a blustery Easter night at the only Chinese restaurant in town. When she asked for the check, the waiter said, "It's just started to rain. You're welcome to stay a little longer if you want." Miraculous. Joan recalls the existence of dogs, craft stores, painkillers, the public library. Green ribboning through coffee, the scent of lilacs near her childhood home, brown sugar on a summer strawberry, her father's recovery from the tyranny of multi-generational alcoholism, the imperfect but true repossession of his life, the euphoria of the first warmth after winter, the first easy breath after a cold, the return of one's appetite after anxiety. Joan has much to be happy about. She thinks I am happy. You are happy, we are happy. These thoughts, as she can force herself to have them. Miraculous.
All right. I'm Tess's oldest brother, Ben Gunty. I'm definitely the most underqualified interviewer she's had in this whole process, so buckle up. Here we go. It is really fantastic to see everybody here. That is definitely the second most hopeful passage in the whole book. So the other one's at the very end, so you gotta get through all of it. In all seriousness, it is really a joy to be here. I just have to, since there's so many of you here, we were just joking that like in Seattle there were 3 people. So, hell yeah, South Bend. It really is awesome to see everybody show up, and I'm just really proud of you. But I have to go on record and say this. I was so honored to be able to be asked by Tess to interview her, and I had this like dream interview in my head right away, and it included 4 really key things. One was a dramatic reading of the most ridiculous online critiques I could find of her book, the voices of the characters of the book. The second was a portion of the interview we were going to call South Bend Hot Takes. The third was going to be a pygmy sloth petting zoo. And the magnum opus was going to be a random selection of an audience member that Tess was going to live paint and glow stick fluid at the end of the evening. Unfortunately, Tess vetoed all of my ideas. She may be a National Book Award winner, but she's also a dream killer. It is a real honor to be here, and what's so amazing about this book is, I mean, I had a little bit of a panic attack when I knew we only had 30 minutes, because we honestly need hours and hours to really unpack this thing, but we're going to do our best, which is going to be great, so it's going to be fun. The other thing I gotta just say on a positive note, I promise you I'm not gonna speak this much, but I gotta say this. I really appreciate you taking the pressure off me. There was a long kind of joke in our family that really wasn't a joke, that the most financially successful person in our family was a public school teacher. So, thank you. Doing what you did. I feel like I can do anything now. It's totally fine. I can quit my job and not be a disappointment. We had to center this thing in South Bend because we're here, which is such a beautiful thing. And I really want to ask you first, why it was important for you. Obviously, Vacaville, this is like really the main character of the book is the city that this takes place in. And it's certainly not South Bend in and of itself. It's an amalgamation of things. But at the same time, like, I really want to know why it was important to you to place this book in a fictionalized South Bend, in the Midwest, maybe in general. And want to understand, like, why it was important for you to anchor the book in that, and simultaneously, you know, how does that show up for you throughout the course of this novel?
Well, first, I just want to say that Ben is my first reader, and he read this book before there was any hope in the world of it being published. He gave me feedback. He supported me. So I think he's kind of underselling his influence on this draft. But I think I was just realizing I moved to New York, and I lived there for about a year when I started writing this book. That was the first time I really lived outside of South Bend. I had lived in Angers for a year, but it was a study abroad experience. And I was consistently drawn back to this place when in my writing. I would even try to set something elsewhere, and I just was pulled magnetically back. And it occurred to me that the post-industrial Midwest is home to millions of people, but I did not encounter any writing that was set here when I was growing up. Not that it didn't exist, but it wasn't coming to me. And I think that insofar, it's just vastly underrepresented in the American imagination, and then insofar as it ever is represented, I think it tends to be flattened into a kind of caricature. And I wanted to write something that was as precise, as beautiful, as mysterious, as vast as I knew this place to be. And so it was important to me to attend to a place that I felt was neglected, and to insist that, as Joyelle said earlier, this is a microcosm of the universe, and I think it's as good a place as any to set fiction.
I love it, and that really was such a beautiful intro, Joelle. So thank you for that too. I loved it. I gotta like get a copy of that and think about it for next year. That's actually a great segue to a question I'm going to ask you later, because I think that I love the complexity of the characters and the character of the city as well. But we guessed on South Bend for just a second. So one thing that I find really interesting, I think especially for debut novelists, you know, I'm an avid reader. You see a lot of debut novelists, especially pull from what they know, and it turns into a lot of autofiction often, and you kind of get a slightly fictionalized version of their life. What I found really interesting about this book is you managed to make a fictionalized version of the place that you grew up in without it becoming autofiction. And even though I could see little moments of like, I was like, oh yeah, that's definitely mom right there. Mostly it's the emoji texting. So I am so fascinated to know, like, how'd you do it? How'd you anchor this book so much in a place that you know, and yet not make it about you? And why'd you do that?
Well, I think making it a fictional place was extremely important in this process. For me, as soon as I set it in a place called Vacaville, it had this glint of the otherworldly, and I'm always drawn to fiction where it could be set sort of in, you know, Joy Williams is a good example of this. Her fiction could be set in Arizona or the afterlife, and you're not really sure when you're reading and so I really love that. I love setting my fiction in places where it's grounded in realism and recognizable things, but it is unstable in some fundamental way. And also setting it in Vacaville allowed me to pull from Gary, Indiana, Youngstown, Ohio, and lots of other cities. I wanted to be able to write a place that almost felt mythical in its construction, and that allowed me some distance from it as well. I think defamiliarization is extremely important to me. I'm always trying to find ways to approach a description, a place, a person in a way that I haven't before. And I also I had written some things that were quite close to my experience, my voice superficially, and I was quite sick of that kind of self-performance. I mean, of course, any novel that you write is a performance of the self. Every self is refracted into multiple voices, but I think trying to adhere to only my most superficial markers of identity was very limiting. And I was trying to write toward something that felt choral and varied and alive. And I couldn't do that if I was setting it inside of a person who was too similar to me.
That's great. I love it. Now I want to ask, like, which part of yourself shows up most of this book? Save that for your therapist. We get, even though you vetoed my South Bend hot take section, I still want to do a lightning round on South Bend. Okay, 5 questions. Here we go. Favorite place in South Bend?
Birdsell Mansion.
One person agrees with you. Okay, I know you talked about the suitcases already, but do you have another favorite memory from the library?
I once found a large number of pesos in a book, and before we looked into it, my parents allowed me to assume that they were still real money and that I could trade them in for a camera, which I really wanted. And then we found out that they were like expired. Expired
pesos? Wow, you gotta look into that. That might have been a lie too. My favorite memory of this library, I love the library, and I'm so glad we're here. I'm also glad that the library got such a good shout out at Joyelle's opening. But our little brother Nick, who did the drawings in this book, which are incredible, by the way, and definitely like an integral part of the kind of beauty and vastness of the narrative. He fell asleep on one of the empty shelves one time. We legit couldn't find it. And there was like a creepy dude in the children's section at the time. And my mom freaked out for a solid minute. And then we found him on the shelf. That's weirdly my favorite memory of this life. Okay, back to the lightning round. Person from South Bend you most want to thank from your childhood, but it can't be your family.
Well, I wonder if some of them are here tonight, actually. But my really good friend in childhood, like from age 3 onward, was Cassidy Berry, and her family took care of me a few days a week, and that was where I first started to write. Her mother Kelly Ray would assign us quick writes. So she'd give us a little prompt and we'd write for a timed amount. And my friend Cassidy was this prodigy. She was so good. She was always doing like really advanced moves in her fiction. And I thought that
like 6.
Yeah. She like said everything in the present tense, and I was like, we could do that. So I think it's like that also set up this whole model of my life. I didn't feel we never felt competitive. She just was this source of like endless inspiration. So I'd like to thank her and her family.
That's great. Well, her dad's over here. So.
Yeah.
Back to the lightning round. Weirdest thing you've ever seen in South Bend?
Oh my God.
Okay.
Joyelle's like, let me count the ways.
The first thing that comes to mind is that when I was studying at Chicory Cafe in college, I walked out. It was like a frozen night, and I was also kind of like numb with studying for finals. And then I looked out onto the street, and there was some kind of parade going on at night. There was flashing lights, there was techno music, there were like child dancers. And
a natural Tuesday night in South Bend.
It was like a weeknight, and it was like gorillas, people dressed as gorillas, and then Pete Buttigieg walked out onto the balcony of the State Theater, dressed up in some kind of like I don't know, like old school military costume. There was like, and he gave an announcement. It was like celebrating some anniversaries. I think it was like some 100th anniversary of South Bend's existence. So, you know.
I cannot believe that didn't make its way in. That sounds weirder than anything in the book. All right, greatest hope for South Bend. That's the last one.
I hope that it continues to involve all of its communities here in its vision for its future, including Indigenous communities, the West Side, everyone, not just, everyone.
Beautiful. Love it. Okay. Interview's not over. Great. Okay. Well, let's talk about the Rabbit Hutch in a little more detail here. La Panière, which is the Rabbit Hutch, the actual building, not the book, it's such a microcosm, and yet, it's one building. You know, you read all the descriptions of the book, it's like, takes place in one building on a hot summer night, you know? And I've been so drawn thinking about this book to the fact of the microcosm of that one place, and yet, the scope of this book is just massive. I mean, we're talking about foster care, trauma, municipal development, abusive relationships, religiosity, economic boom and bust, politics, climate change, capitalism. We're just scratching the surface, folks. I mean, really, the juxtaposition between like the microcosm of this one particular apartment building and the macro of the book itself and the scope of the book, it's just a marvelous experience as a reader, first and foremost. And I'm just so curious to understand how you came about coming to a place where you took this very singular place, a shitty apartment complex in a struggling Midwest city, and then end up drawing out this extraordinary scope of themes and characters and hopes and fears and all of that. Like, take us through that, because it's just an incredible experience as a reader.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I tend to write very associatively, and I tend to be a very micro writer when I'm very obsessed with sentences, sounds, language, precision of images. And I really do believe that when you're attending to the very small, you end up reaching the very large. Like when you're trying to be as precise as possible, I believe that the universal is revealed in the particular. And so whenever I begin a project with some kind of macro vision about all the themes that I want to address, it ends up being flat and sort of preachy and ineffective. But when I just start out trying to describe a broken down apartment building in great detail and the people who live there, I find that those smaller things take me by the hand and lead me to the larger problems.
That's great. Well, on that note, then I think like what's interesting about that is that the micro and the macro on this really, really big level is just one of the juxtapositions. I mean, that's like the really big picture juxtaposition, but there's all these amazing juxtapositions in the book that I think really in a lot of ways like mirror a lot of what Joelle was talking about at the beginning of, these different truths and realities, and you weave in and out of all of that. It's dark and comedic, it's deeply religious, and then very nihilistic at times. It's pessimistic and deeply hopeful. It's abrasive and then tender. And I just would love to understand why you chose to put so much of this in tension with each other in 331 pages.
Well, actually, a phrase that Joyelle McSweeney was my advisor in college.
This interview is really just about you, actually.
I'll read all of it immediately. But I was just conducting an interview, and a phrase that you used was, you're drawn to things that are double but not binary, and indivisible opposites. I find that to be a really helpful way of thinking about everything, really. I think that nihilism and hope are always coexisting, and they're actually not as opposed as we think. I think like the violence and the tenderness for me are always coexisting, the humor and the sadness. All of these things and kind of throughout the book, they have to be kind of multiple nutrients within the same soil. And in order to have a healthy soil, you need it to be as rich and diverse as possible.
I love it. I really just love that so much. It really is just so cool. I mean, it so mirrors the chaos of our lives, right? The randomness of it, and sometimes the randomness makes you a National Book Award winner, and sometimes it doesn't, but that's life, and the fact of all of that being so proximal is a really special thing. So, okay, speaking of the National Book Award, which I missed your ceremony because I was at a concert, but I didn't know it was going to be that night, okay? But I did text my wife saying, I'm hopeful. So, that's the results of my work. In your acceptance speech, she didn't want me to bring up her acceptance speech because the thing that she wrote to me the next day was, it was awful. I was like, it was good. But you said attention is the most sacred resource that we have. And you could talk about that if you want in a second, but what I find interesting about that sentence, particularly the concept of this book, is that you play with our attention a lot in this book. And to be clear, I find the narrative very cohesive in every way, and yet the narrative itself is very truncated. Every chapter is kind of jumping through a different character, sometimes even a different form. We've got a whole chapter of illustrations, we've got an obituary, we've got a list of facts in one of them. And so it ping pongs us from chapter to chapter, and within each chapter there is some of that element too. So I'm so curious to know, attention is the most sacred resource we have. Why do you believe that's true? And then how do you think this novel addresses with that idea? And why did you play with us so much with that throughout the course of this novel?
Well, there are, I guess, a few answers to this. And one is that that idea became, I guess, very important to me when I encountered this essay by Simone Weil in college called Attention and Will. And she says something like, attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. To know that this man who's hungry and thirsty really exists as much as I do, that is enough, the rest will follow. And I don't know if that's exactly how she phrases it, but to me that became a kind of a guiding principle of my writing. To know that someone exists as much as you do, that their pain, their joys exist as much as yours do. I think that any kind of revolution, personal, political, on any scale, begins with that kind of attention. And then I think also in this book, defamiliarization is important to that kind of attention, refreshing your sort of. My mom was an art teacher, a really amazing art teacher, as many of you know. And one exercise I remember us doing in class, in your classes, was that you would take, a photo and you have to turn it upside down and then try to draw it. And often these drawings would be so much more accurate ultimately than the ones that we would do if we were just trying to, look at the photo head on. And that's because you're not filling in the gaps with all this kind of mental shorthand. You're really seeing everything anew. And I think that's what I try to do when I'm attending to characters, try to flip the portrait upside down and see everything more accurately, and by seeing it more in a more unfamiliar way. And then I think I was learning from a lot of other books where the main character wasn't a person, but a place, an idea, an object, that you can pay close attention to something and still refract the narrative through lots of different lives and characters. So for me, the one thing I was trying to pay attention to consistently, it was a few things, but entrapment and freedom, this city, Vacaville, and then I was also trying to sort of ask the question, what do we owe each other? And in every chapter, that was what I tried to ask.
Did you try to answer that? No, not yet.
The question is the answer.
Yeah, right. Okay, well, let's get into some of the characters then, because I think the characters are just beautiful in this book. I love them so much. So we're going to have to hone in on Blondine in a second, because she's such a key force in this book. But before we do, all of these characters are your creation, including the city itself in many ways. So I know you love all your darlings, but is there a character in particular that you're especially drawn to, or that continues to really live in your consciousness?
Yes, and in fact, she was a character who didn't make it into the final draft. And
wow, shady. Tell us.
Well, I used to have this very long chapter kind of toward the middle of the novel. It was about 50 pages. Most of these chapters are relatively short. But this was a kind of a brief history of my main character's experiences in foster care. She, in her particular experience, she bounced around between families. And I wanted to think about the main sort of, the most significant events that occurred in each of those phases of her life. And throughout that time, which was a time of great instability and pain for her, she had a relationship with a librarian, a much older librarian who she met when she was a child, who, her name was Annette. In this, she always wore red glasses, and she was I described her as kind of a tree. She was very tall and serene, and she kind of recognized that this child had a kind of voracious curiosity and a lot of energy and intelligence that needed to be nourished, and she would guide her to books. And that's kind of like how you don't get it now in this final draft, but it's how this character ends up at a private school getting this kind of scholarship in town and this very highly coveted financial coverage for her education. And I think she sticks in my mind a lot because I knew people like Annette growing up who just kind of quietly, humbly, without any pretension, took the work of taking care of other people very seriously and took it as a kind of daily task, just looking for ways that they can affect changes in their immediate environments, looking for people to take care of who need to be taken care of, and never imposing any other agenda upon that other than what are resources that I happen to have that this person happens to not have, and how can I redistribute those? And yeah, I knew a lot of people like that growing up here, and so she sticks in my mind.
That's great. Well, editing is such a huge part of the process, of course. Like, what made you pull that out?
Well, I guess it was a few things. One, I decided not to include, it was kind of a rule for myself that I wouldn't include a lot of backstory in this book. The book takes place over the course of 3 days one summer, and if I started to include backstory, unless it was directly relevant for some event that happens in the course of the action, the whole book would be, it'd be 1,000 pages. So that was one reason, and I wanted there to feel like a kind of relentless present tense to the narrative, a propulsion that was kind of forcing you through these 3 days. But also, I struggled with the idea of, I guess I never wanted any of the characters who were in foster care to be seen as representatives of foster care, because you can have lots and lots of different experiences in the foster system. And I knew that as soon as I included one experience, then I would have to include others to balance it, or if that one experience would be read as emblematic of the entire system. And I just, I wanted to kind of respect what I think of as the sacred particularity and individuality of each experience.
That's great. I think it was a great choice, because it is so interesting, especially with the foster care being kind of a backdrop of the 4 kids who live in this apartment. I mean, I guess they're young adults. And we have to glean so much about what their individual experiences were with very little information. So it's a really cool narrative move. Well, let's talk about Blondine. Besides Vacaville, I mean, Blondine is the protagonist in many ways in this book. And I mean, she's just an incredible character, and being with her in the arc of this book, obviously that something very tragic is going to happen to her right away. So that's a really compelling hook. And then along the way, at least for me, like I just was continually drawn to the complexity of her and everything that she represented in her contradictions, and also in her like idealism in a lot of ways. So one of the things, though, and I know we've actually gotten a chance to kind of talk about this in my kitchen sometimes, but what I find, what I think one of the most interesting things to me about Blondine, particularly now that you've won a National Book Award, we can talk about this in the where it's going to stand in like the long list of great literature, but particularly in relationship to like really key protagonists in a lot of great American novels, whatever the heck that means. She is the quintessential perpetual victim. I mean, all sorts of terrible things have happened to her. I mean, it starts at birth, where she's born with opioids in her system because her mom's addicted and is abusing, substances when she's pregnant. And yet, what's so fascinating to me about her is that she resists being the victim, like literally at every turn. I have to like just this part. I didn't really catch until I read it like for the 17th time. But Blondine's. This isn't going to give anything away if you haven't read it. But she's walking through kind of what is her sacred place, which is the valley, and these 2 men who are out for a walk or a jog or something start to harass her. One of them in particular starts to harass her, and she ignores them. They keep harassing her, and like anybody, she turns into a cat and starts like hissing at them, which is like funny in a dark moment, but still like it's tense. Like even as I'm reading that, it's just a tense moment. But then immediately the analogy that's drawn to her is this. Blondine recently learned that white barn owls reflect moonlight off their feathers to temporarily blind the voles they're hunting. Everybody does the best she can with the resources she has. Mm-hmm. And it's a great line, first of all, but also you immediately compare her to a predator, a bird of prey in particular, who's hunting. And so in a moment of victimhood, she's still not the victim in that way. And I just think that's so fascinating. And so we just got to talk about that. Like, tell us about that and what that represents for you and how you went about doing that.
Well, I'm really glad that you read it this way. I mean, for me, Blondine was the heroine that I always wanted to see. And I think her refusal to participate in the narratives that have been written for her was a crucial element to her status as a hero in my mind. I think that especially the men in this book are trying at every turn to sort of make her a peripheral character in their narratives, and she's aware of this and she is resisting it at every turn. I think that is frankly I mean, I was drawn to that just because that is what so many young women have to do in the patriarchy. They have to understand the narratives that have been written for them and then write against them. And I also think at every moment in this book, I was trying to trouble the predator-prey binary. So anytime a character is kind of illustrated as a predator, I wanted to immediately start to think about what ways in which they were prey. And then the same, vice versa. And Blondine was this kind of really from the very first sentence, she was this incredibly active character. She just, even when she's still, she's having all of these extremely turbulent and intentional inner dialogues with herself. That started with her activism. I think the very first scene I wrote was her disrupting this very fancy dinner with a very a bizarre sort of, I guess some people consider it like akin to eco-terrorism, but she doesn't harm anyone. She just freaks everyone out. And I think that she sort of taught me who she was in that moment. She's also got a streak of resistance. She resists for the sake of resistance. I don't think she's ever convinced that any of her efforts are going to come to fruition, but she feels that she cannot live with herself and she cannot live in this place unless she is doing something.
Well, that's so interesting because, there's a moment with one of the other characters who's asking her why she, like, you could do anything. You're smart, you could go to college. We know that we can't, specifically the other foster boys that she lives with. Why do you stay here? Is her staying in Vacaville itself a form of resistance? And if so, how? And what does that represent to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that loving a place is the same, is indistinguishable from, forcing it to be its best self and to sort of hold it to its highest standards. I think that you can't love anyone or anything without believing that it can be that best version. And I mean, not to say that you only love things that are great, but I just mean, I think that she is the sort of fiercest, she has the fiercest devotion to the town of any of the characters, precisely because she can see what it could become. And she's fighting at every turn to make it that.
Yeah, she loves the possibilities of what it can be, which is a beautiful thing. So now everybody gets to convince you to come back to South Korea after this. It's going to be great. Last question on Blondine. I do want to just say we're going to take some audience questions pretty soon. I only have a few questions left, so start to think of them, and then we'll rely on Trey's expertise to figure out what we're going to do on this. So Hildegard von Bingen is widely quoted in this book. No shout-outs for Hildegard right now. Okay. Right, we got 1, 2. All right, go Mystics. But it's interesting because there's I love the way in which the she mystics and anthology plays out in this book and continuously gets referenced and quoted. And there's this one particular part that I just gotta bring up with Blondine. Blondine's always reading this book and quoting it. And there's a moment where she continues to read in the valley, continues to read this part of She Mystics and Anthology. And at the very end of this passage, it says, human being, which is also the name of the chapter, human being, God is just, and therefore he has ordained all he has made in heaven and earth with justice and order. And it's one of the few passages that really narratively Blondine goes out of her way to disagree with. And I'm so interested to know why she rejects that.
Well, I think to me, this is an example of the rejection actually acting as a confirmation of the passage. Like, I think Blondine has been forced into a world of chaos and injustice. She's understood from birth onward that everyone's dealt a different hand at birth, and that it's not a meritocracy, and that there are all sorts of unfair forces that are playing out on various scales at all times. But I actually think that her resistance toward that passage, her sort of visceral insistence that the world is not just, is evidence that she herself is the container of the justice. I mean, she is the force of justice. She is the person who can see that things should be just and good, and they're not.
That's good. Okay, last question. In the acknowledgments, your very last acknowledgement is thanking the reader for finishing what you began. And what I found so particularly enjoyable about this book, probably one of the most enjoyable books I've read, well, it's my favorite book. Which is true. I'm not lying. It sounded like it was lying, but it's true. But I truly, like, every time I've read every version of this, which has gotten better and better and better as you've edited it, I have felt so respected as a reader. And I wanted to just, you're a prolific, voracious reader, far more than me, but it feels awesome to be respected as a reader when you're reading a book. And some of that is because this book is hard to read at times. It's complex, the narrative weaves in and out, you're playing with form, you're playing with content, you're playing with themes, characters, all these different things. And so I just want to know how you think about your readers now that you are a novelist. I'm a novelist now. Now that you are a novelist, like, how do you think about your reader?
Well, I think this is something that I internalized from a very young age because, I'm the youngest in our family. I don't know if you remember that. I have 3 older brothers, and I think I grew up assuming that everyone at the table was more informed than I was about everything, and they were smarter and they were better.
It was a terrible assumption. But I'm glad I got you here. Continue.
So I think throughout my life, I've been drawn to books, people, groups, different kinds of challenges where I feel like where everyone around me is smarter than I am. And I think there's a piece of advice from Jeffrey Eugenides to write as though it's a letter to your smartest friend. And I guess I always assume when I write that the reader is smarter than I am, that I'm always like,
it's impossible.
And I think that kind of assumption, it allows me to assume that whatever interior life I'm interrupting or collaborating with is complex, varied, interesting, and kind of competing with my book for their attention. And so I really think about reading and writing as this kind of sacred collaboration between 2 imaginations. I think that the reader and one thing I love about reading is that every book is completely different in each reader's imagination. And to me, that's the most beautiful kind of chemical reaction between 2 minds that I can think of. So I try to always write with that assumption.
Well, you do an amazing job at this book. It's tremendous. Okay, Trey, can we turn it over to the people?
All right, everyone. So we have 2 mics, one right here, and then one with my colleague Sandy over there. So as Ben and Tess call on folks with questions, we will run around with these mics to amplify you for your questions. So whenever you 2 are ready.
We're ready. I don't have to answer the questions. Are you ready?
You can ask Ben questions, for sure.
What questions do y'all have? We'd love to hear.
Do we have a hand?
A few over here.
Could you explain the title of the book?
Yes, so the Rabbit Hutch is what the residents of this apartment building where most of my characters reside call the building. The building was given a fancy French name by a donor who wanted it to sound chic. And so the French word is la lapinière, which is kind of an antiquated French word, roughly meaning rabbit warren or rabbit hutch. And so this is a title that kind of came to me early on, and I just thought it would, like the idea of, I don't know, this kind of wonky philanthropist wanting this affordable housing complex to sound chic in French. I thought it was it tickled me, so I kept it. But then I watched Michael Moore's documentary, Roger and Me, and there's a scene.
You gotta read it.
Yeah, I'll just read it. So there's a scene, I talked about this last night, so I'm sorry if you were also here at my event at Notre Dame, but there's a scene where Michael Moore sees a sign on the side of the road saying rabbits, pets, or meat, and he goes to investigate, and he finds this woman who has lost her job, and she's breeding rabbits for a living, and she kind of is showing him the rabbits, and she says, if you don't sell them as pets, you got to get rid of them as meat. Them guys are all meat, but see, they start doing this to each other. She points to the rabbits. What's that? Asked Michael Moore. Peeing on each other and stuff like that when they get older. If you don't have 10 separate cages for them and they start fighting, then the males castrate the other males. They do. They chew their balls right off. Then you have a bloody mess. That's why you got to butcher them when they get a certain age, or you have a heck of a mess. That's from Rhonda Britton, Flint, Michigan resident. And so I thought about that image as a sort of.
I told you that passage was the second most hopeful thing in the book. I warned you.
That's the epigraph. That's one of the epigraphs. So I was thinking about horizontal violence a lot when I was writing this book. The way that pressure on communities from colonial forces, from structural forces, from capitalism, white supremacy. It creates all of this pressure on communities, and there's a kind of energy that is directed toward the oppressor but can never reach it, and so sometimes misfires horizontally. And what the rabbits really want to kill is the cage, and instead they're killing each other. And I think a lot of when you're trying to trace interpersonal violence and neglect to structural violence and neglect, that image was helpful for me.
Thank you. You mentioned, read the polyphonic form you used. What again attracted you to that? And was it like a multimedia filmmaking kind of approach?
Yeah, so I think people have different definitions of polyphonic fiction, but for me, I just use it to mean any kind of multi-voiced fiction where there are multiple characters and storylines that are coexisting. And I was reading a lot of it at the time. I have a ton of kind of contemporary fiction that followed that form that was electrifying to me. And I kind of talked about this before, but these forms to me really trusted the reader to sort of trace their own residences, to get lost, to wonder, and to sort of to kind of be the guide, their own guide throughout the narrative. And these forms were extremely receptive to protagonists that were not people. And so I kind of knew I wanted to write about a town, and I wanted the town to be the main focus. Actually, Under Milkwood was something that Joyelle recommended to me when I was writing my thesis in undergrad. And I listened to it. It's a radio play by Dylan Thomas, and I listened to it again as I was revising this kind of over and over again. There are many voices. It's very sound-driven. It just takes place over the course of one day in this fishing town, this kind of port town. And that was just one of the many influences. But yeah, I have a whole list if you want recommendations.
Did you formulate this all in your mind before you began to write it down? Or did you sort of change things?
The question, just in case you couldn't hear it, is did you formulate this in your mind before you began to write it down, or did you change things as you go? Did I capture that?
Yeah.
Mostly? Okay.
No, so I tend to write without an outline or without a plan, really. Every time I do, it's dead on arrival. And so I just allowed really each sentence to carry me to the next. I try to trust a kind of subconscious logic. I always find it to be more honest and more interesting than my conscious brain. And then once I had about 3/4 of it drafted, I did make a kind of outline for the major events, just because it is a kind of chaotic structure, and I needed to see it all at once. So I posted them all around my room and lived within that outline for a few years, actually. And I took things off the wall and I added things, and that helped me formulate the last fourth of the novel.
You talk about the defamiliarization you go through, and you explained it like in this art exercise. How would you say you did it?
Oh, yes. Teacher voice, here we go. You can do it.
I was saying that she mentioned the defamiliarization process that you were going through, and you explained it with this art exercise, but what does that look like in a writing exercise of how to like look at a situation and flip it on its head? Was that a mental thing? Would you, how would you do it?
I think it changes depending on what I'm trying to describe or what I'm trying to say, but very often what I do when I'm stuck is I use this random word generator online, and then I take the list of words and then force myself to use them kind of associatively in the chapter and let me kind of like hopscotch from one word to the next. And I often find that helps me a lot because the words then end up getting used in these really strange ways. And that kind of unlocks something that was, something that needed to be loosened. And I guess I just often spend a lot of time, like, if I'm trying to describe a fire or a bar or something like that, I will spend a lot of time just looking at the thing and just like kind of, looking at it, kind of meditating on it for a long time and trying to find new associations. If you're really focusing on something intensely and you're paying intense attention to it, I find that you always see something.
I think we have time for about one more.
I wonder if you are completely finished with these characters, or whether you put them in a box on the shelf and say, I'll get back to you one of these days. And if you are finished and they go out of existence, do you feel sad because you finished them all?
That's a really lovely question. I think they do feel like real people to me, and I will remember them like real people that I've known. I think in order to sort of cope with the book being published, even though there are scenes that still appear to me and sort of things that I want to add or change, or, the character would have this reaction. And I probably will always think of Blondine as a kind of guide and hero. I have to sort of distance myself from it and say, it's over, it's out of my hands. I read the audiobook kind of by accident because the actress who's supposed to read it got COVID. And I found it to be, it was a great experience on the one hand, but it was also kind of painful because it was the first time that I'd read my book without being able to change anything. And so I think that was when I said, okay, I have to let these characters go. And I don't have plans for this to be a sequel or anything, but you never know. Maybe Blondine as an 80-year-old will show up.
Is this the best audience you've ever had?
Yes.
I've watched and attended like an uncanny number of these things, and y'all really are the best. So thank you so much for coming here. Just as much as she says in the end, like the reader completes what she started, you all made this event what it was. And I just want to close out this portion by saying another huge thanks to the St. Joe County Public Library. Is this your first library event?
Yeah. Yes.
I don't live in South Bend, but it's such a special thing. So thank you all so much for doing what you do here. And Tess, I just want to again thank you for allowing me to be part of this night. It was really fun. And one thing that is so cool about you winning the National Book Award at 30, being the youngest winner since 1960 when Philip Roth won, is said, well, there's only downhill from here. But but that's not actually true. And what is really cool is that the best is yet to come. And I think what Joel was saying in the beginning of you understand what sentences could do, and more importantly, what they might be for, is so true. And it's a privilege to be your older brother. And this book is amazing. So go read it, go buy it. It's incredible. I'm really proud of it.
National Book Award winner and South Bend native Tess Gunty. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight and being here and fighting the traffic at the cold. So we do have books. Like I said in the beginning, they're limited supply, probably more limited since we began, of books being sold by Braden Lair just down the hall here in the auditorium lobby. Tess will also be signing books as well in that same area. If you can't get a book tonight, you can always head on down to the Braden Lair bookstore in the near northwest neighborhood at 1005 Portage. So just go to your local bookstores, or you can borrow it from the St. Joe County Public Library. However, the collection team tells me there's a very, very long line. Thank you all for coming out.